Welcome everybody. This is Simon Turpin of Answers and Genesis UK. And while we're in this period of lockdown, we're continuing to redeem the time, to make the best use of our time by trying to give you some helpful information on the creation evolution debate. And if you want to be prepared for the modern creation evolution debate, then you need to watch this interview. I'm pleased to have with me today Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, joining us from the United States. Welcome, Nathaniel.
Thank you very much, Simon.
Nathaniel, it's important to stress that he has a PhD in cell and developmental biology from Harvard University, so he's very informed to speak on these issues. And you may have already heard of Nathaniel because he's released his book in 2017, Replacing Darwin, the New Modern Origin of Species, and recently a more lay-friendly book for people like me, so we can get to grips with it, Replacing Darwin Made Simple. And we're going to talk about some of the things that are in that book tonight. So, Nathaniel, let me ask you the first question. How does the creation model explain the scientific data better than the evolutionary model?
I wanted to do one other thing before I answer that question, just give our audience a little bit of a sense for the difference between the two books as we go through some of these evidences that we covered in both.
Yeah.
The way I think about it is, when I sat down to write Replacing Darwin, the first book, The New Origin of Species, I wrote a book that I wish I had when I was a student, that I could give to my evolutionary classmates, colleagues, who aren't even asking questions because they think evolution is true and the Bible must not be science, and why would you even consider this, and why are you even talking to me? So it's designed to raise questions in their mind, then answer them. It's written as a giveaway book. It's got the gospel at the end. Again, it's something I wish I had in my hand to just hand off to someone and say, you're a science colleague, you're interested in this topic, you believe evolution is true, you need to read this, and be a self-contained, cover-to-cover, take person from where they're at. The book doesn't assume they know anything about the Bible or anything about creation. Take them from wherever they're at and bring them to, look, the evidence supports creation even better from a scientific perspective. And then Replacing Darwin Made Simple is designed, just as the title says, to take that technical information and make it simpler. Now, Replacing Darwin, the first book, I had a pastor read through it just because I wanted it to be understandable. It still has a fairly steep learning curve for people who don't have any background in it, but it's designed to take someone who has no background in genetics, and we'll talk about why genetics is such an important field momentarily, and teach them everything they need to know about the topic. And again, it's the steep learning curve because there's a lot of genetics involved, but it's with an unbelieving audience in mind, but designed to be understandable. Yeah. And then Replacing Darwin Made Simple is with a believing audience in mind, someone who says, yes, I believe the Bible is true, but could you help me, equip me to take this information and engage someone? In a sense, I've asked the believer to do something difficult with Replacing Darwin. It's still rather technical. So someone might say, well, I can't read this, but I know I need to give it away. So here, unbeliever, read this. I haven't read it, but it's going to change your mind. Yeah. So this is to help people say, this is the main message. Here's why it matters. In Replacing Darwin, I'll make a point that has huge implications for the creation evolution debate, but I won't give the full background necessarily or why it's significant for evolution, because I'm thinking of an unbeliever who reads it and says, oh, he just answered the main thing I've been complaining to creationists about for 4 decades. And so he knows immediately, this is a big problem for me. Whereas the believer who might not read Richard Dawkins like I do, or be steeped in evolutionary thinking like an unbeliever might say, okay, well, why does that matter? Why do testable predictions matter? That's what Replacing Darwin Made Simple does. The first half of the book is to explain to people, here's in a very understandable way, the cliff notes of how species form, both from a biblical perspective and a scientific perspective. And then the second half of the book says, what do we do with this information? Yeah. How do we engage an evolutionist? What are they going to say? What are their main arguments? And how does this new information engage those arguments and refute them and equip the believer to say, sorry, those are not legitimate objections to the Bible. Let's get back to the main issue, which is the gospel and your suppression of the truth about God and nature.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, before we go to that first question again, because I know you have invited evolutionists to dialogue with you on this book, even offered to debate them. And I know you have some interesting stories there. Can you tell people about that?
So far, the only official debate I've done on the book, and I've done debates with evolutionists that where the book isn't explicitly the topic, but since the book has come out, I've done one with Herman Mays, who's Dr. Herman Mays, who's a PhD evolutionary biologist in the United States at Marshall University in West Virginia. And the explicit topic of the debate, we did it online. You can find it online. We've got the video on our website. I've got a write-up on our website giving the cliff notes of what happened and what he said and the ramifications and so forth. I did that with him in the fall of 2018. So the book came out a year prior. We did the debate 1 year later. And it was revealing, but I'd say largely unproductive. Revealing in the sense that after the debate, I went back to his blog. Someone pointed me to his blog, and he had written an article several years prior titled something like "In Defense of Ridicule." And his point was the debate has gone on so long that there really is no point debating creationists anymore. We should just make fun of them.
Yeah.
And if you know that was his attitude going into the debate, you can understand his behavior, which he showed little evidence of having familiarized himself with the arguments of the book. He just spent most of his time essentially mocking, trying to make it look like I didn't know what I was talking about, but really couldn't offer any substantive answer to any of the arguments in the book, so that's revealing, and it gives you a sense for probably the dominant attitude among evolutionists today. They just say, this is a stupid discussion. Why should we even discuss it? And when creationists show up, we just mock them. Yeah. And if you've tried to engage people online, you've probably encountered that attitude as well. Our viewers have probably encountered that attitude as well. So it's revealing, but that's not productive. It doesn't help advance the debate. It doesn't let people know where the issues lie. It doesn't advance the science. It's not a scientific way, obviously, to advance this debate. But that's unfortunately where things are at. And my experience, I think, reflects the general state of affairs these days when it comes to creation and evolution.
Yeah, so basically evolutionists tend to take the scoffing or mocking approach to the debate.
Yes.
So with that in mind, can you then explain how the creation model explains the scientific data better than the evolutionary model?
Yes. So let's say we could have a substantive discussion with an evolutionist.
Mm-hmm.
I'll frame it that way. What would be the key points I would give to him? Or you might even say, if you're on the elevator with someone and, oh, you're a creationist? Yes. Well, isn't that religion? No, it's very scientific. What? So what would you tell them? In a nutshell, what I would tell them is, and let me see if I can advance the slide here real fast. Nope, that didn't work. So I'll try a different key. There we go. One of the first things I'd say is creation explains the obvious evidence equally well as evolution does. Mm-hmm. So going back to 1859, one of Darwin's main points was that it looks like species have migrated to their present location. So if you look at the distribution of species around the globe, say mammals and birds, what you find is mammals are distributed, land mammals are distributed among all sorts of land continents, and they tend to be missing from islands. And the species we find on islands are those that can swim there or fly there, and they tend to be lacking land creatures. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the evidences Darwin cited. And so his conclusion was species have migrated to their present locations, and that was one of his arguments against the creationism of his day. Well, the Bible doesn't teach the fixity of species or that God created them in their present location. There was a rather significant event in Genesis chapters 6 through 8, which say the whole surface of the earth was erased, and the land-dependent, air-breathing creatures survived on board the ark and restarted in the Middle East, and therefore must have migrated to their present locations. So creationists agree with Darwin's argument in that sense. They explain that obvious evidence fairly equally well. He also made arguments about the similarities between the domestic breeds of species, like the various breeds of donkeys and horses and so forth, compared them to the species in the wild, and made an argument for the formation of a limited number of species from that perspective. And that's the type of argument I would agree with him as well. So on the elevator, I'd say creation explains the obvious evidence equally well. Some of Darwin's simpler arguments, but still relevant in his day. We explain them equally well. I'd say creationism explains the popular evidences for evolution equally well, and we'll just cover a few here. For example, this argument from homology, or the similarity, so homo meaning the same, ology meaning the study of biological sameness. You can see the structure of the forelimb here in several creatures. Human, I think this is frog, bat, porpoise, horse. You can see from top to bottom, there's a similar structure, 1 bone, 2 bones, and then the wrist bones and digits. There's a similar pattern in each of these species. The underlying details differ from one to another, but there's an underlying pattern. Evolutionists say there's no explanation except that these 5 species must have inherited this pattern from a common ancestor. Well, if you look at how humans design things in the world today, and Genesis 1 says we're made in God's image, so there's something about us that reflects something about God. So if we find a pattern in which humans have designed things, this may give us some hints into the patterns in which God designed things. We design vehicles with underlying similar anatomy, you could call it. There's a similar structure to a car and a truck and so forth. And the reason for that is not because engineers sat down and said, let's try to make and design vehicles in a pattern that most resembles common ancestry. It's because the pattern works. And so that same principle applies equally well to the biological world. This sort of structure and pattern works. Or a favorite question I like to ask people who criticize the design patterns of life is, well, how would you design it differently? Someone was trying to, I was at a chiropractor and he was complaining about the bad design in the human spine. I said, well, what would you do different? And he really hummed and hawed and didn't have a good answer. They love to criticize.
Yeah.
And one of the things I've learned as evolutionists, and I can personally attest to this, I've also lacked this, evolutionary biologists never get trained in principles of design and engineering. It's the argument is basically, well, I wouldn't design it this way, therefore it cannot be designed this way. It's really a sad state of affairs. Another common popular evidence for evolution, so this is one of the ones you'll find in textbooks, and creation explains it equally well. We design things in so-called homologous patterns. Why wouldn't God do the same thing? I alluded to this just a few minutes ago, but we do not believe in the fixity of species. We don't believe that God created the red fox, the Arctic fox, all the various breeds of domestic dogs, the walrus, all separate. Rather, God created kinds of creatures, is what Genesis chapter 1 says. And the general rule of thumb for this seems to be that it's at the level of family, not species or even genus. That's a classification level. And so this represents probably the best approximation that we have now for the created type, which means Noah takes 2 of each kind on board the ark. New species form within those kinds after the flood, but you don't see changing of one kind into another. You don't see foxes changing into cats. You see all sorts of breeds of wolves and coyotes and foxes and various species of those and various breeds of dogs, variation within a kind, but not change from one kind into another. So evolutionists love to trumpet the formation of new species as evidence for evolution. Well, of course they form. They form within kinds. What you don't see, though, and evolutionists do not cite examples of this, is change from one kind into another. They try to. They try to come up with evidence for this. They'll cite things like transitional forms. Like this is Tiktaalik here, an artist's reconstruction of the features that they would say represent the intermediate state between a ocean water-dwelling creature and a land-dependent land-dwelling creature. It has a head like a amphibian or reptile and scales and limbs like a fish, and the limbs look like half limbs, half legs. See, they say, here's the evidence for the popular evidence for changes of one kind into another massive wholesale change between 2 fundamentally different types of creatures. And do they even think about what a design explanation might be? Probably not. If they do, it's, well, I wouldn't design it this way, therefore God wouldn't design it this way. Well, let's take a more rational approach to this. How do humans design things? Think of the military. We design cruisers, all sorts of warships for bringing firepower across the oceans. We design tanks for bringing firepower on all sorts of land terrain. And if we want to move between the oceans, the water, and land, we design transitional forms, amphibious assault vehicles that can function as boats, not as good as warships, but they do their job in the water, and they can function on land, not as good as tanks, but they do the job that they need to. They're perfect for the transitional environment between water and land. So when we see something like Tiktaalik, oh, it's a transitional form. yes, but humans naturally design so-called transitional forms. We explain this obvious evidence equally well. So we explain the obvious evidences equally well, like the evidence from migration, the evidence that there's a limited amount of speciation that's happened, comparing breeds to species, and I discussed some of these in much more detail in both books. And we explain transitional forms equally well. And we could go on and on about the other popular evidences for evolution. We explain the obvious ones equally well, the popular ones equally well. What I'd say, though, is what makes it, and what, the type of evidence that's supremely in favor of design would be the obvious design of life.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the amount of effort and money and manpower and mental energies exerted at helping the world's best athletes perform better. There's a lot of science that goes into it. And yet when we look in nature, the aerodynamic shape of the dolphin and other types of sea creatures, we often marvel at the designs and the engineering and the achievements that we see in nature, so to speak. And if we have yet to achieve that, in fact, scientists are taking inspiration from what we see in nature. If the best minds, the best human minds on the planet have yet to achieve this sort of design and engineering, it points to a supreme intelligence behind this. And of course, you can think of all the various types of athletes, from swimmers to runners. Again, you see supreme design in nature. So the most fundamental fact of biology is the appearance of design. Even Richard Dawkins recognizes that life looks designed. Yeah. And he wants you to believe that evolution provides a better explanation. Intuitively, we all know that no, that doesn't make sense. They try to come up with, well, here's something that could plausibly explain it. Fine. Well, it could be that the moon is made of green cheese, and I might be able to come up with mutations in natural selection as a scientifically plausible sounding way to explain how this could have occurred. Of course, with evolution, one of the differences between the green cheese analogy and evolution is Michael Behe has done a lot of work. He's not a creationist, but he's done a lot of work showing that you can't actually build certain structures by evolution. But let's say you could. Intuitively, no, we look at the moon and we say, that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't look like it's made of green cheese. And the same thing applies in life. Yeah. The appearance of design in life most naturally fits the explanation that life is designed. And it's hard to think of any other explanation for it. And in fact, when you think of the fact that God has designed creatures to adapt, it just boggles the mind. We don't have a good analogy for that level of design and engineering. We, again, try to imitate the design we see in nature, the existing structures, the existing aerodynamics of the cheetah and so forth. But designing a car, let's say, to adapt to winter conditions and summer conditions and rain and shine. We design cars to be able to withstand a variety of environments, but to actively assume various forms under different circumstances. That's just a whole level of design and engineering that we can't even touch yet. So not only does creation explain the obvious evidences, the popular evidences equally well as evolution, it explains the most fundamental fact of biology much better than evolution does. And when we drill down into the genetics, this is the last point I'd make, I guess, on the elevator, is when you look at the most important lines of evidence for evolution, the most important field of science when it comes to the origins question, that's the field of genetics. Creation actually explains it better. You get down to the technical evidences, creation explains the technical evidences for evolution far better than evolution itself does. And there's great irony here. One of the subfields of genetics in which creationists are actively succeeding and surpassing evolution is the rate at which genetic mistakes or mutations occur. Mm-hmm. Here we have the engine of evolution, and irony of ironies, it's the creationists who are doing a better job making predictions about the rates at which this should occur. It's sort of swiping from the evolutionists the most fundamental aspect of their theory to achieve an end they never wished to have achieved. So on these 4 points, the obvious evidence, the popular evidence, the technical evidence, and then the most fundamental aspect of life, creation either is equal to evolution or it exceeds it. And so this is sort of a snapshot of the major salient points I make in these books, the reasons we have to replace Darwin, and the salient points believers can make when engaging someone who thinks it's just ridiculous to think that somehow science supports what Genesis says, and that intelligent people would actually look to Genesis for scientific inspiration and guidance for their research.
Yeah. And so a common argument from evolutionists would be that creation isn't science because it doesn't make predictions. But I know you've made a number of predictions in your book. Can you tell us about the success of some of those?
Yeah. And I want to step back for a minute. I've been mulling over publishing a book, Replacing Darwin, for kids. And this is such a key point. I've been thinking through, how do you explain this concept of testable predictions to children? And I want to camp out on this for a minute, just because, at least in the United States, there is a whole legal field revolving around this concept. You look back to decisions made in the US courts in the early 1980s, when there was a raging debate here in the United States, and they were trying to incorporate creationism into the public school curricula. So here we have private schools, but the vast majority of people go to state-funded public schools, and there's been, of course, strong opposition to have anything creationist in these schools. Well, legal decisions were handed down in the early 80s, and one of the main things that the judges decreed was that creationism isn't science because it doesn't make testable predictions. So there's the legal backstory, at least here on this side of the pond, to why this is so fundamental, and evolutionists love to cite it. That's why they love to cite it. See, you can't legally do that in the schools, because obviously here's the standard of science as dictated by these judges, and your ideas don't meet that standard, so keep them out of my classroom. Don't indoctrinate our children with your religious ideas.
Mm-hmm.
So what is a testable prediction? In a philosophical sense, philosophy of science sense, it's a statement that future observations, future experiments could reveal to be true or false. So gravity is a scientific idea because it predicts that if I pick something up and drop it, it'll fall to the floor here close to the surface of the earth. And me picking something up like this, here I have a water bottle. If I pick this up and then I drop it, gravity predicts, so me letting go is still future, gravity predicts that it's going to fall. Thinking of how to explain it to my kids, how do you communicate this concept of the passage of time, which is so central to the idea of testable predictions? Well, we measure time here in terms of sleeps. We're going to grandma's house and 10 sleeps, and somehow that helps them understand, my 7-year-old and younger, okay, if I go to bed, wake up the next morning, I got to do this 10 times or 7 times, and then finally be the day to go to grandma's house. So what's a testable prediction? If I explain it to my kids, it's you say something, you sleep, you wake up and you see if it's true. There's your testable prediction at a 7-year-old level. And that's the essence of the creation evolution debate. Evolutionists say we don't do this. So now you can explain it to your kids. Here's what they say we can't do. And the reality is that's factually incorrect. So I've put the date of this scientific article here down here in the lower part of the screen, January 2018. That's significant because this finding, this announcement, was published several months after I published my book in fall of 2017. And one of the predictions I made, so we put the book in print and there were many sleeps that followed before this paper came out, was that there would be a certain rate at which species form. And so this comes from the concept of Noah taking kinds on board the ark, which is about the level of family, those kinds coming off the ark and then forming new species. And given just 4,500 years of history instead of millions of years of history for animals, there's very different predictions that evolution makes versus what creationists makes on the rate at which species form. Well, exhibit A for evolutionary biology has been these Darwin's finches. There's a group of finches, a few of them shown here, in the Galapagos Islands, and only in the Galapagos Islands, that have been studied for several decades. Well, this brand new finding that was announced in January 2018 was in this particular this species of finch. They said a new one formed. And I found out about this actually in February, Darwin's birthday, a favorite day for evolutionists to try to put a stick in the eye of creationists, saying, na, 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 see what you don't know or can't do. And so they were announcing, here's a good thing to shove in the face of a creationist. Well, if you run the math about the rate at which these species have formed, and this is the only known example that I know of, that is a real-time measurement of a new species forming. So here's our first example of it, formation of a new species documented in real time. And what is the rate? It matches exactly what the Bible predicts. It's remarkable. And again, it's highly ironic. Just as creationists are predicting the speed with which copying mistakes occur at the genetic level, the engine of evolution, we are also predicting the rate at which species form. And their favorite example of evolution, Darwin's finches, are what shows up time and time again in the evolutionary textbooks as to here's evolution in action. I've also made testable genetic predictions in the book, and one I want to highlight here real fast, because this is what's ongoing right now. If you go to Ken Ham's Facebook page or to the Answers in Genesis YouTube channel, I'll probably end up doing about 20 of these presentations. We've recorded about 6 and premiered about 6 of them, looking at predictions in human genetics. So if the human DNA, if our global human DNA is only a few thousand years old and not 200,000 years old, you should see, here's a prediction, testable prediction, and one I put in Replacing Darwin. You should be able to see the stamp of human history all throughout the human family tree based on DNA. And episode 6 is one we just premiered over the past weekend, where I look at the history of human population growth, and boom, you see it showing up time and time again. The world population growth has a shape like this, and I won't spend the time deriving it because you can see it in the most recent video, how DNA records human population growth. But you can infer it. So here's the shape of human population growth with the numbers here on the right. If you take a published tree from this particular paper, an evolutionary paper, but you can infer population sizes from this and say, what is the history of population growth, which I'm going to plot on this axis. Again, I'm zooming through this explanation, but the point is, this is a smoking gun of human history, and I've titled that episode, part 6, episode 6, the smoking gun of human history. You can see perhaps the most profound echo of human history. World population growth has this hockey stick shape. You can see it in our family tree. Shouldn't be here if the human population is hundreds of thousands of years old. So that's one of other testable predictions we've made, and we're already seeing them come true. So let me back up here for a second, clarify. The legal case against creationism is that we don't make testable predictions. We don't make statements, sleep on it, wake up and see if they're true. The fact that I've put predictions in Replacing Darwin already means that legal case is rendered null and void. I'm not the first person to do it. You can look at the history of young Earth creationists, geology and so forth, other fields of science. We've done this. That argument is invalid, void, and outdated. Mm-hmm. What's even crazier is we've taken it a step further, and those predictions are coming true. And I've highlighted the Darwin's Finches one in the Replacing Darwin Made Simple, this one about human history, where we're rewriting it essentially, seeing the echo of it and rewriting it, post-dates the publication of that book. So the YouTube channel right now is the best place to find it, and I'm hoping this will lead to a book in 2021, which is the 150th anniversary of Darwin's explanation for human origins, his book, The Descent of Man.
So creation actually ticks the gold standard of science. It actually makes predictions, which is amazing.
And something the evolutionists have had no answer to. I don't see them, and well, what I should say is, because I'm on evolutionary blogs and other places where you on occasion see them discuss creationist findings, you never see the mainstream technical literature discuss it. But I'm beginning to see the role reversal occurring. So historically, creationists have been the ones saying, well, evolution can't be true because this problem, X, Y, and Z. And evolutionists have said, in essence, you're wrong, and so what? You don't come up with a better explanation. Well, now we've not only surpassed them in science and come up with a better explanation, these explanations are leading to predictions that are coming true. I'm beginning to see the roles being reversed, for now they're having to nitpick what we're saying. And I can say, number one, you're wrong. And number two, so what? Come up with a better explanation. It's really wild to see the traditional roles for creationists and evolutionists trading places, essentially. Now they're having to take the traditional role of the creationist while I'm sitting here in the driver's seat. We're sitting here in the driver's seat saying, come up with something better if you want to call your idea science.
Great. And we shouldn't be surprised at that, given what we know about God's word and it being his revelation. But one of the stumbling blocks, I guess, for many people, Christians and non-Christians, is the age of the earth. But you actually have some great evidence from genetics to say, well, actually, the world can't be millions of years old. It points to actually around 6,000 years. Can you tell us something about that?
Yes, and before getting into the specifics, I just want to stamp my foot, so to speak, on this foundational concept that biology has embedded in it a time concept. This has big ramifications for the young Earth versus old Earth creationist debate. By and large, that's been dominated by astronomy, geology, and, well, can't we find some common ground in biology? It's becoming almost impossible to talk about biological evidence without some reference to a time scale. So that doesn't work anymore, and it's going to make the dividing line between young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists all the more stark. And frankly, from my perspective, I think young Earth creationists have zoomed into the lead on this, and I have yet to see the old Earth creationists come up with good rebuttals. Well, rebuttals to what? Now the specifics of this evidence. So one of the evidences and one of the clocks in biology that we can point to as being consistent with the young Earth time scale is, once again, this rate at which species form. Now, the evolutionists, of course, do not agree with my conclusion. I'm just taking the raw data and saying this is what it means, and of course they would find that horrific because they disagree with that total time scale, and they are want to avoid anything that unsettles the established millions of years time scale. But that's one evidence. This paper that came out in the implications for the rate of species formation in Darwin's finches, this is one of probably many more evidences to come. That's one general category. The rate at which species form is a clock. The current data that we have points very clearly and unambiguously towards the post-flood timescale. In the Replacing Darwin book from 2017, I go through a lot of other evidences, technical genetic evidences, genetic clocks in various species that point towards a recent origin. What I think will hopefully really break this debate open, I want to hit this again, is the evidence within human DNA, because this is something everyone can relate to. Everyone cares about this. Find the average person who cares about the rate at which fruit fly change their DNA. You won't find too many. Everyone wants to know who they came from. This is a hot topic, and the evidence that's coming in overwhelmingly points towards the recent timescale. Again, one of the best smoking guns. Not only do we have data from maternally inherited DNA and paternally inherited DNA, the rate at which this change occurs points toward the young Earth timescale, but some of these other things you'd expect to be true if our DNA is in fact young are showing up to be true. So DNA records family trees. Let me derive just real fast here the basis for what I just showed. DNA records a family tree because there's differences that occur between us. We can recreate a family tree of humanity. And if you think about what family trees tell us, so in my family, and thinking about male inheritance, I've got 3 boys. I've got 3 branches coming off my tree. The number of branches reflects the number of sons I have. The number of branches on a family tree, the family tree around the globe, reflects the population size of people around the globe. And if you go back in time through history, throughout the deeper branches of the family tree, it's going to reflect that as well. So DNA records family trees record changes in population size. Therefore, the DNA family tree of humanity should record and reflect this hockey stick shape of human population growth. It's been slow and gradual for over 2,000 years, beginning in 1000 BC, and around just after the Black Death, especially in Europe. This began to spike upwards due to advances in agriculture, medicine, so forth. So if the family tree of humanity is only a few thousand years old, it should reflect this hockey stick shape. And because DNA records changes in population size, we can infer that from this family tree, and there it is. This structure should not be that. This is a positive evidence for creation. This isn't so much, well, evolution can't explain this. It's, hello, people. If you look at the entirety of the family tree, this is the shape that shows up again and again and again. It's hard to miss. And boy, is this exactly what you'd expect if the family tree is young. So this is hopefully just the beginning of the evidences as the series goes on that we're premiering again on Facebook and showing on our Answers in Genesis YouTube page. We'll talk about more regional evidences. One example, when we get to the history of the Americas, especially the pre-Columbian Americas, we know that once Columbus and Europeans arrived, the indigenous population underwent a massive crash. This is mainstream science. It went on for about 300 years and then recovered. The evolutionists talk about the crash. They don't see the recovery. One of the papers that is in press right now, a technical research paper, shows that no, only with the young Earth timescale can you see the crash and recovery. This is a regional example of this same type of data. So again, this is just the beginning of, we know these events happen in history. They shouldn't show up in our DNA, and boom, there they are. We all know these historical events. They're not obscure things. We know about the Mongol conquest of most of Eurasia and Eastern Europe. These sorts of things should be showing up again and again, and these are the types of things we're seeing, testable predictions, and again, types of evidences you can see only if you view it through the lens of 6,000 or 4,500 years, and not through the lens of hundreds of thousands, millions of years, as the evolutionists say.
That's amazing. And the fact is, you cannot argue with that evidence, right?
I'm anxious to see how the evolutionists try. Their main arguments have been with, and let me just add a little side note here. They're aware of the mitochondrial DNA. This is DNA inherited through mom. They're aware of the paternally inherited DNA, those clocks where you measure and count the number of differences between mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, to get a sense for the speed at which this clock ticks. Well, one of the main rebuttals has been, if they finally acknowledge that the data is real and legitimate and valid, is, well, this is an artifact of the modern era. Perhaps it was slower in times past, or maybe natural selection eliminated some of those other mutations in times past. And so this is how they try to reconcile the facts with their predictions. One of my first responses to them would be, well, how does your natural selection explanation make testable predictions? How is that any different from saying, well, God did it? You know, they love to make fun of creationists. God did it. That explains everything. Well, natural selection did it. How is that scientific?
Yeah.
Give me a prediction. You won't find any that I can see where there's a statement that future observations could reveal to be true or false. Well, in a sense, that argument is saying, well, we've got a piece of data from the present, mother-daughter DNA differences, father-son DNA differences, and we extrapolate it back in time. The data that I'm showing here are not data taken from the present and extrapolated back in time. This, in a sense, really is historical data. This is taking the branching structure throughout the whole tree, throughout the whole history of humanity. There really is no way you can try to say, well, what's going on in the present was different in times past. This is the past, according to the evolutionists themselves, and no one that I've seen has yet to try to touch this.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, thank you for joining us tonight, Nathaniel. That's been some great food for thought for people. Hopefully, if you want to dig further into this, then please do get one of the copies of either Replacing Darwin or Replacing Darwin Made Simple. Pass them out, especially Replacing Darwin Made Simple. Pass them out to people in your church. We'll put links to those in the comment sections. And I know, Nathaniel, you have a Facebook page called Replacing Darwin. So if people have further questions, they can contact you through that.
Yes, and I designed that also to hopefully be a safe space of sorts, not just for believers, but for unbelievers. They read the book, they read one of these books, and I've really got a problem with this. Well, come ask your questions. This is not a place where I'm looking to hammer people down or embarrass them. I want there to be open, honest dialogue, and a place where they can safely raise their objections. Well, what about this? What about that? I do ban trolls because, as you might expect, there's plenty of folks to come in and don't read a word of what you say and still tell you why you're all wrong, and it's just totally pointless. So those type of people I have banned, but genuine seekers and skeptics have at it, and that's one of the main reasons I set it up. So for skeptics, but also for sure our supporters, fellow creationists. I've got a public Facebook page, Nathaniel Jeanson, as well, for the purpose of making this answering questions, having dialogue that much easier.
Great. Well, Nathaniel, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thank you very much.